these are the moving parts of the EB5 program. Number one, we'll have the investor, who is a foreign entrepreneur. This is the person who is not a US citizen, not a US green card holder, and they bring funds, they bring the money, and in some cases, they also bring the plan to create a new business. So that's number one, the investor. Number two is their funds, the money that they're bringing to the table. The US government requires that these have to be lawfully sourced. So the investor must have a narrative, must be able to present documentation to explain where they come from and how it is all lawful. Number three is a new commercial enterprise. That is a business entity inside of the US, very important, must be in the US, that receives the investment funds. And then that new commercial enterprise then either is the job creating enterprise or it gives the money to a job creating enterprise. That JCE must create 10 full-time jobs using these funds that the foreign investor has made available. So as you can see, this is a program whereby the USA wants to bring qualified foreigners who have lawful money and who want to put that money into the USA and create 10 jobs in the economy. And of course, this is a reasonable endeavor. It's very praiseworthy. America wants to encourage this sort of behavior. And so the reward for that is a green card. There's two other concepts that we should cover at the very bottom here. We'll mention a targeted employment area comes in three different flavors: rural or high unemployment or infrastructure. And the targeted employment area brings extra benefits and bonuses, more bang for your buck, so it were, or in fact, same bang but fewer bucks. It gives you a reduction in the investment amount that you must make to qualify. The second concept is a regional center. Regional center is a way for you to park your money with another entity that you don't control, and that entity can help take care of your money for you during the time that you invest it. And this also has some rewards. It also allows favorable econometric analysis processes. Next slide, please. So what are the investment requirements? As we said, they must be lawfully sourced. You have to explain how they're lawfully sourced. And you must also show the path of funds. The path of funds is somewhat straightforward usually. It is bank documentation to show where the money comes from when it's in your control. Generally speaking, the lawful source of funds is going to be the primary legwork that you do in preparation for an EB5. That's something that you and your immigration attorney will have to track back through your finances and figure out the narrative and present documentation. Now, the normal minimum amount is $1,050,000 US, $1.05 million. And if you invest that amount, it doesn't really matter where you invest it. It can be anywhere inside America. And as long as you create 10 jobs, then you have the eligibility for the green card. Now, importantly, that $1.05 million has been reduced to $800,000 US if you focus it in a targeted employment area. So the job creation has to occur in a rural census tract or in a high unemployment area census tract. So those things are very dependent on the exact area you're investing in and the data for that area, the population levels and the employment or unemployment levels of that area. So that's one concept. Completely separate from this, we mentioned regional centers. This is a choice that every investor needs to make for themselves. Do they want to do this as a standalone investment, or do they want to put it into a regional center? So there's a couple of different hypotheses and scenarios. A standalone investment is where we have the somewhat romantic Wild West idea of a foreign entrepreneur, briefcase in hand, an idea in head, and they come to the US with their money and they say, I want to create a factory, or I want to build a hotel, or I want to engage in some other lawful business enterprise that creates 10 jobs. So that would be a standalone. There's only one investor. There's no pooling of funds. You're not doing this with anybody else. It is possible for you to work with American investors. You can invest your $1.05 or $800,000 into the US and have American buddies helping you out, but you cannot have any other foreigner helping you hoping to get a second EB5. A standalone investment only supports one EB5, and that is your own. Or the second one is a regional center. The regional center is much more popular. It's much more numerous. Historically, I would say 99% of all EB5 cases I've handled have been regional centers. And that is where another entity, a regional center, is entrusted with your investment money to take your funds and to mix it with many other funds, often with numerous other EB5 investors, and then create 10 jobs per investor. Either way, regardless of whether it's targeted employment area or not targeted employment area, regardless of whether it's standalone or regional center, you still need to have the same results at the end. The proof, as they say, is in the pudding, and the pudding is creating 10 full-time permanent jobs for qualified employees. Next slide, please. So then for you, what does that mean? That means the EB5 timeline for the investor is you're going to have to file the initial form. The form number is 526, or is 526E if you are filing with a regional center. That distinguishes the two, standalone versus regional center. And at the same time, if the investor is in the US and their country of birth does not have a waiting list for EB5, they can also file the AOS, the adjustment of status. And that is a placeholder filing for Uncle Sam, for the US government, saying, "Dear Uncle Sam, I have filed the I-526. I believe I'm eligible. I leave it up to you to determine whether or not I'm eligible. But if I am eligible, please automatically consider this AOS, which is my application for a US green card." So this is very powerful. If you can file the I-526 or I-526E, as well as the AOS, adjustment of status, then as long as it's been properly filed, as long as the AOS is waiting in front of the immigration services, you can then lawfully remain in the US patiently waiting for this to happen, even if your initial non-immigrant visa expires or non-immigrant status expires. The pending AOS allows you to remain here. So that's very important. It's flexible, and it is also likely to be time limited. It's possible certain countries may have waiting lists, but we'll go into more details about that a little bit later. Next big step, you file the I-526, which for rural projects takes a shorter time, it's faster. Regional center, we're currently seeing maybe a year and above processing time. Rurals are somewhat faster. But upon I-526 or I-526E approval, then you can adjust status if you're in the US, or if you are not in the US, you can then have consular processing for a visa stamp at a US embassy or consulate. And both of those take you to the same end state. That is a 2-year conditional lawful permanent resident card, a 2-year green card. And then within the final 3 months of that 2-year green card, you must also then file an I-829 application to remove conditions. That turns your conditional green card into a permanent unconditional green card. Once that is approved, you then hold an unconditional green card, which lasts for 10 years, and every 10 years you have to revalidate it and file it with immigration. Now, your money, that is the second major part of the puzzle. What happens to your money? Well, your money must stay invested for at least 2 years. That is immigration requirement. And they recently, in August or September, they clarified what they mean by that. And they mean 2 years measured from the date of investment and filing the I-526E. So on the first day that both of those conditions are true, you count from 2 years. So that now helps clarify things immensely. For the previous decade or so, 15 years or so, they did not clarify what they meant by 2 years. So there was a lot of uncertainty. Now we know. Next slide, please. So for the EB5 standalone investment, very quickly, an investor invests in a lawful for-profit business inside the US. This contemplates the investor will be very closely involved with the process. So the investor will have to handle determining the targeted employment area, if that's what they want. They can and usually do closely manage the business on a day-to-day agenda. Oftentimes they're even sitting there at a desk in the business, and they're creating 10 specific full-time jobs of warm, living, breathing human beings. So these are literally 10 full-time jobs or higher. However, filing the EB5 does not give you the right to be in the US. You would have to find some other way of coming in, and the most common one is the E-2 that we'll talk a little bit we'll talk a little bit more about later on. The E-2, simply put, is kind of like a temporary work investor visa. The EB5 is more like a long-term permanent green card that takes a longer time to adjudicate. And as we said before, the standalone investment only allows one EB5 investor. You cannot pool funds with multiple foreign friends and hope to get EB5s for all of them. That is not permissible. Then the second option, the much more popular option, is a regional center investment. And this is where an investor subscribes with a large-scale existing product to pool funds with other EB5 investors. Usually, the regional center already takes care of the TEA, already takes care of figuring out if it's rural or high unemployment. And the regional center will also help manage the business creation, business job creation and management. And they can use econometrics to calculate job creation at higher level volumes. So simply put, what that means is if you invest in a regional center with, say, 100 other EB5 investors, well, that's 80 million US dollars right there, minimum, that they're working with. They probably don't have time to measure each individual hard hat on the construction area or each pair of boots on the ground. Instead, immigration allows regional centers to abstract the job creation from money in to job creation out. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit more about the standalone investment. Next slide. This used to be called the Direct EB5. Recently, they renamed it. So now in 2022, it's called Standalone. You'll still hear some people say, oh, I did direct investment EB5, but that's all in the past. Let's jump to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about standalone investments. So the structure, we have here the investor at the top. They must make lawfully sourced investment funds into the new commercial enterprise. And the new commercial enterprise then can itself create 10 full-time jobs, if that's what's preferred, or they can give the money to job-creating entities, which are separate entities. One very important limitation, the JCEs must be 100% wholly owned subsidiaries of the NCE. So if you do give it to company A, which gives it to company B must be 100% owned by company A. It cannot be part owned by other companies or other investors. So that's just one important thing to keep in mind. And then you want to create 10 qualifying full-time jobs. You're actually going to track the people individually. Where are they? Where are they sitting? Where are they working? And try as much as possible to make sure that where they're sitting or working is inside a TEA if that was part of your plan at the initial stage. Next slide, please. So the petition process, you file the form I-526, not the E. This gives you an EB5 priority date. Again, if you're in America, and if there's no waiting list for your country of birth, you can also file a 485. And the pending 485 lets you stay here without getting any further unlawful presence, but it also allows you to apply at the same time for a work permit and for a travel permit. So for a lot of people, say if you're if you're an overseas student at a US university on an F1 and your parents give you $800,000 to invest, you could conceivably file the 526 and also file the 485. While you study, you have the 485 pending, and you can also apply for a work permit, which lets you work on the pending EB5. So very flexible. It gives you a head start, a jump start to starting your life in America and putting down roots. However, stage two, if there is a waiting list, which there currently is not for any country as we speak, which is November 2023, if there is a waiting list, you must wait until your priority date is current for your country of birth. So until it's current, you cannot file the 485. Right now, there is no waiting list for new EB5s. For old EB5s, you can check online. There are quite a few waiting lists, but those have already closed. And now if you file an EB5, you're under the new categories. The word around the campfire, the guess of the industry, is that EB5 probably will not have a waiting list until possibly late next year, late 2024. So fingers crossed. If this is something you're interested in, then time is of the essence. If the investor is outside of the US, you must go via consular processing and DS-260. That involves an interview at the consular post. And then, as we mentioned, there's a conditional lawful permanent resident card for 2 years. In the final 3 months of that 2 years, you must file the 829, and then you get a permanent green card after that's approved. So that is the standalone petition process. Let's jump to the next slide. Then a regional center. This is where you pool your funds with other EB5 investors. And the next slide after this, let's jump to that, and that will show us the structure. Now, this structure looks very similar to the standalone structure, except over in the upper left-hand corner, you can see there is a regional center. So the regional center is going to be a key part of this, and that is what lends the classification for the new commercial enterprise to be included under the regional center designation for immigration. The new commercial enterprise typically gives the money to a job-creating entity or multiple job-creating entities, and they then create 10 qualifying full-time jobs. As mentioned before, this can be abstracted via econometrics. Very useful if you don't want to keep, if you don't want to worry yourself about the individual tax details of every single employee. Sometimes these can number to the thousands or tens of thousands. Let's jump to the next slide. Pooling investments. So a regional center, as we mentioned before, this is a designation, that the Immigration Service gives to basically any business that has applied for one. However, this is a very lengthy process. It takes about 2 years to get a regional center designation or more, with the end result that is usually not worth your while to bother getting a regional center designation to apply from scratch. There are hundreds of existing regional centers, and regional centers are allowed to include new projects under their aegis, under their umbrella. So it is much more common for you to find a project you like, and then that project has already teamed up with a regional center. Regional centers usually charge an administrative fee. And if you do go with a regional center, this might be perhaps ballpark 10% of the ultimate investment amount, 50,000 to 80,000 and above. Those are fairly typical for the industry. Immigration has said that this extra administrative fee for the regional center must also be included and disclosed in the lawful source of funds analysis. So then the rest of this is fairly similar, but money goes to the NCE. They receive your investment. They then give that money to the JCE to create jobs. And then you need to work your way through many contractual business investment documents, some of which are listed there. We don't have time to go into those right now, but obviously your immigration attorney, if they're experienced with the EB-5, should be able to help you walk through those and give you an idea of what elements are important from an immigration viewpoint. Let's jump to the next slide. Accompanying family members. This is important. They can be included in the green card. You can include a spouse of any age, only one. And you can also include children who are unmarried under the age of 21 at the time of 485 filing. Note also that if your spouse is born in a different nation, you might want to consider which nation they're born in and which nation you are born in, because if one spouse has a wait list for their nation, they may use, in certain circumstances, the nation of the other spouse. Aside from that, there's a separate issue about children who are nearing the age of 21, because you do have to add in extra time for the whole processing, the legal process to go through. So that's something just to put a bookmark in that. If you or somebody you know has a child who's getting close to 21, talk to your immigration attorney about that and they can help. Next slide, please. The source of funds. Just a couple of bullet points as I'm getting close to the end of my permissible time. Common income, common source of funds is employment or entrepreneurship, or liquidation of assets, property, real estate, stock, or loan issued on assets. If you own a nice house and the bank gives you a loan for it, you may use that. Less common is cryptocurrency, monetary damages from lawsuits, life insurance policies, and so forth. Those have been filed before, but they're less common, and perhaps immigration services might be a little bit less familiar with those. But one thing is certain, all of these funds must be owned by the investor. Next slide, please. Then we get to the removal conditions. This is the final step. A couple of bullet points are on there. Note that you don't have to create, this is the part, the removal conditions, where generally speaking, we're hoping you can prove you created 10 jobs. Remember, the first step, 526, is saying, I plan to create 10 jobs and I prove my money is lawful. The 829 is proving afterwards, hello, you gave me this, you approved my 526, you gave me a temporary green card. The 829 is now saying, I delivered my promise to you, Uncle Sam, to create 10 American full-time jobs. All right, let's jump ahead. There are synergies with other visa status categories. I won't go into too much detail. The most important one is the E-2 treaty investor synergy that my colleague, Attorney Jean, will talk about. You might want to take a quick screenshot of this about H-1Bs, B-1s, and F-1s that might dovetail very nicely with the EB-5 category.
Benjamin explained the EB-5 is pretty much available for people from most countries around the world. Of course, if there's certain illegal activities going on, we don't want to encourage that. So if there's any kind of those activities, you would be excluded. But the E2 is basically even more restrictive. As you'll see, it's somewhat easier to process, but it's only limited to specific countries that are listed in the State Department website. And you'll see, I did put, this doesn't include all of them, but I did include a list that has some countries like Australia, Bangladesh, Bahrain, South Korea, Pakistan, and Senegal, Togo, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. So some prominent countries that we want to note that are left out would be like Brazil, People's Republic of China, India, Indonesia, Iran, Nigeria, Russia, UAE, and Vietnam. So generally, you cannot use the E2. If you have multiple citizenships, please do contact us because it could vary, depending on your citizenship situation. And we have been seeing, some clients that could have multiple citizenships could apply, depending on which citizenship you have. And the next slide we'll go over. Next slide, please. So slide 2. Generally, EB5 is pretty challenging, as Benjamin, explained. There are a lot of regulatory requirements. It does give you an easier path to becoming an immigrant. I don't know if this has been explained before, but the green card is technically the card. It used to, actually many years ago, it actually used to be green. So that's why we call it the green card. It would pretty much lead to permanent residence. The E2 is a little bit easier, as you'll see, but it's a non-immigrant visa, which means you come in and you technically have to have an intent to depart. So you set up your business, and it is basically like a 2-year, conditional visa that you come in for 2 years, and you do have to renew it every 2 years, which can be a little bit more challenging in some ways, but also can be easier in some ways. So that's why we want to give you this presentation. And next slide, please. So as you can see in slide 3, the EB5, honestly, for most people, will require an investment over $1 million. The very basic minimum, as Benjamin said, is $800,000. But with fees and everything like that, it's usually ends up being over $1 million. The E2, it doesn't actually have a specific amount that we're looking for. We do look for a substantial amount and usually recommend over $100,000. Like the EB5, the funds must be traceable. And I don't know if this has come up before, but we highly discourage any use of digital coins in terms of transfer. These funds should all be traceable and, of course, legal funds. And after you invest in the enterprise, you do have to be in a position to develop and direct the enterprise. And we recommend this for people who do have some executive or supervisory skills. As you can see from the EB5s, it could be a bit more passive in that you could send your money to a regional center. But the E2, we do really recommend that you're actively and directly involved in this enterprise. Next slide, please. And slide 4, so EB5, it generally does take a little bit longer to process, and there's greater scrutiny of funds because when you do adjust your status, as Benjamin said, it makes it a little bit easier to become a permanent resident just because there's so much scrutiny in the beginning. But the E2 is often completed faster. We don't guarantee a specific time because a lot of the processing is often done at the foreign embassy or consulate. Sometimes we've actually had, people print out the documents and we direct them, which office to go to in their country. So it could be easier in some ways, but also, you do have to, in many cases, go to the physical office. So, as we said, the results can vary depending on which country you're processing. Next slide, please. And as Benjamin said, for job creation, generally for EB5, we're aiming to create 10 full-time jobs. And depends, obviously, as we said before, if you do a direct or regional center investment. For the E2, there isn't a specified requirement to create a specific number of jobs, but you are trying to substantially develop the enterprise, that you do have income that's more than enough to just basically be a marginal amount that supports you and your family. We're basically thinking that, you're coming to develop business in the US, and that's, why the US wants you to be able to come here. And again, this is, non-immigrant intent visa, but basically you are trying to develop the business as much as possible.